In March of 2003, a regional dairy extension coordinator named Dale Voss stood at the podium of the Fond du Lac County Agricultural Extension meeting and told a room of 23 dairy producers that the operation Mara Feld had just inherited out of dairy. He said this calmly, with the patient tone of a man who had delivered difficult information to farmers for 28 years, and he meant it kindly. He gestured at a slide showing the price trajectory of commodity milk and the capital requirements for a competitive Holstein operation, and he said that Mara would need a minimum of 200 head on a total mixed ration program to make the numbers pencil at current prices. She had 34 brown Swiss cows on 87 acres of rolling pasture in Fond du Lac County, and her grandmother's 2 leaking milking units and a parlor roof that needed replacing before the next hard rain. Mara sat in the third row and did not answer him. 18 years later, in the spring of 2021, her niece Nora sat at the kitchen table of that same farmhouse and read aloud from a county assessor's document. The number was $2.1 million. Wide. I.K. It covered 3 properties, 431 acres, 118 brown Swiss cows, and a waiting list of 23 direct market customers who paid more for Mara's milk in a month than Dale's commodity contracts would have paid in a year. Mara was standing at the sink when Nora read it. She did not turn around. She poured herself a cup of coffee and set the pot back on the burner, and that was all. This is the story of what happened between those 2 moments. There are people who will tell you that the dairy business is about volume. They are not wrong exactly. They are wrong about what the word volume means. Let me tell you what Mara Feld understood about that distinction and how she came to understand it from a dead woman's handwriting. Ruth Feld had farmed those 87 acres in Fond du Lac County since 1951, when she and her husband Gus arrived from a failed rental situation in Dodge County with 12 brown Swiss heifers, a second-hand milking machine, and a lease on a debt they spent 11 years paying off. Gus died in 1979. Ruth kept milking until 2001 when her hands gave out, and she died in November of 2002, leaving the farm to her granddaughter Mara because Mara was the only one in the family who had ever asked what the cows were for. Mara was 29 years old, working as a veterinary technician in Oshkosh, and she drove up on a Thursday in January of 2003 with 2 weeks of clothes and no plan beyond keeping the animals fed. The farm was not impressive by any accounting. The parlor roof sagged in the northwest corner. The surge milking units were original to 1961 and held together with wire and familiarity. The pasture fences were serviceable but old. The herd itself was the part that made Dale Voss sigh when he walked through 6 months later, because brown Swiss are a dual-purpose breed, which, in the extension vocabulary of 2003, meant they were neither the highest-yielding dairy animal nor the most economical beef animal, 34 of them on 87 acres. None of them in confinement. All of them rotated across what Ruth had divided into 11 paddocks by hand-strung wire. Ruth had left 2 other things, and they were in a box on the top shelf of the parlor cabinet. 2 leather-bound ledgers, cracked at the spines from 40 years of handling, filled from front to back in Ruth's small, careful handwriting. Not farm accounts, exactly, though the numbers were there. Ruth had recorded for every cow she had ever milked the butterfat percentage and protein percentage of the milk at each monthly test, the somatic cell count, the sire information, and a note about the animal's grazing behavior, how far she ranged, how long she stayed on fresh grass, how her production shifted by season. 50 years of this. Cow by cow, season by season, from 1951 to 1998, when her eyes stopped cooperating. The first 3 weeks, she barely left the barn. There were 34 animals to keep milking twice a day, and a parlor heater that ran on fumes, and a water line that froze twice before February. She learned which cows were nervous in the parlor, and which ones set their feet and would not move. And she learned to read the milk output meter on the old surge units by the sound of the vacuum seal rather than the gauge, because the gauge needle had been stuck since the previous decade. She repaired 3 sections of fence with wire she found in the equipment shed, her hands going numb in the cold and then coming back to feeling in a way that made her swear quietly and keep working. At night, she ate whatever was simple and sat at the kitchen table under the hanging lamp and read. Mara sat with those ledgers for most of the winter of 2003. What Ruth had been doing, she came to understand, was selecting, culling the animals whose components dropped below a line she had set in her own mind, keeping the ones whose butter fat held above 4.5% and whose protein percentage stayed above 3.6%. Breeding back to the bulls whose daughters held those numbers longest into the season. She had done this without a genetics laboratory and without a university publication on milk composition. She had done it because, as she noted once, in the margin of the second ledger in 1974, a cow that gives rich milk gives true milk, and a cow that gives water with color is costing you twice. Ruth's best recorded butterfat reading was 5.1% from a cow she called Bess in the 1967 records, the heifer she had selected herself from a neighbor's herd in 1965. The cow in the far stall of the parlor that January was Bess's granddaughter, heavy-shouldered, dark-coated, with the calm, large eyes that brown Swiss carry as a breed trait. She was 11 years old and still milking. Mara named her Bess, too, in the ledger she had started for herself because it seemed the right way to keep the record. Let me tell you what Dale Voss did not know about those ledgers in March of 2003, and what nobody in that extension meeting knew, and what the dairy industry itself was only beginning to understand at university level. Beta-casein is a protein in cow's milk. Most dairy cows, and particularly the Holstein lines that produce the majority of American commercial milk, carry 2 variants of the gene that codes for it. The A1 variant, cows with 2 copies of the A2 gene, what geneticists call A2A2 homozygous, produce milk that contains only the A2 form of the protein. Brown Swiss as a breed carry unusually high rates of the A2 variant because they were not subjected to the same intensive selection for volume that remade the Holstein population in the 20th century. Ruth Feld, selecting for butterfat percentage and protein yield across 5 decades, had been selecting by proxy for A2. A2 homozygous animals without knowing the genetic mechanism that explained what she observed. By 2003, Mara's herd carried what testing would later confirm as one of the highest natural rates of A2 genetics in any unmanaged brown Swiss herd in the Great Lakes region. Mara did not know this in 2003. She would not have the herd genotyped until 2012. What she knew in 2003 was that her milk component tests, which the co-op ran monthly, showed butterfat above 5% and protein above 3.8%, numbers that the standard Holstein operation, producing commodity milk, and she knew that the co-op paid her $9.40 per hundredweight for that milk, the same price it paid anyone else, because commodity milk buying does not distinguish by component quality beyond certain thresholds. It pays for volume. She called the co-op in August of 2003 and told them she would be ending her contract. She had, in fact, been saying this to Dale Voss since March. Dale had come out to the farm himself in late February of 2003. a courtesy visit he made to every transitioning dairy operation in his county territory. He drove a white university-marked truck with the extension logo on the door and wore clean loafers that he did not change out for barn boots, which told Mara something before he had said a word. He walked the parlor, consulted a clipboard, looked at the surge units with the expression of a man who had not seen them outside a textbook, and asked her what her plan was for the herd. She told him she was going to continue her grandmother's breeding program and develop a direct market channel for component milk. He had nodded the way people nod when they are formulating a response, rather than absorbing what they just heard, and he pulled a folded printout from his clipboard and laid it on the parlor work table. The break-even for a dairy in Fond du Lac County at current commodity prices requires a minimum operation of 180 to 200 head on a corn-based total mixed ration, he said. Your grandmother ran this as a retirement income supplement. That was appropriate for her situation. What you're describing is something different. He paused. You'd need capital you don't have and a genetics program that would take a decade to build. Mara looked at the printout. What's the break-even for selling milk that's worth more? Dale smiled the way extension agents smile when a question misunderstands the scope of the analysis. The premium market is a fraction of a percent of total fluid milk volume, he said. It's not a business model. It's a hobby. He picked the printout back up, refolded it carefully, and put it in his jacket pocket. I'd be glad to walk you through the transition options for Holstein conversion if you want to call the office. She did not call the office. The extension meeting in March of 2003 was the first time Dale Voss called it a sentiment operation in a room with other people listening. He was not present for the phone call to the co-op, but he heard about it, and at the Fond du Lac Dairy Producers annual meeting in January of 2004, he told 3 producers over coffee that the Feld girl had walked away from a guaranteed buyer, and he said it with the gentle pity of a man who had seen this before and knew how it ended. What Mara had worked out was a direct marketing approach. Raw cream sales to a small cohort of buyers, she built one at a time, starting with 2 restaurants in Fond du Lac and 1 cheesemaker in Sheboygan County who had been looking for high-component milk he couldn't source reliably. It was slow. In 2004, she cleared enough to cover her feed costs and her milking equipment repairs. In 2005, she cleared enough to replace the parlor roof. She added a 3rd buyer in 2006, a specialty grocery that had opened in Green Bay, and her price per hour hundredweight for the raw cream allocation climbed to $26. That same year, her neighbor, Carl Bauer, made his move. Carl was 37 in 2006, 2 miles east of Mara's farm, and he had watched the commodity dairy projections closely. The extension publications and the co-op representative were both saying the same thing. Scale up now before the capital costs made it impossible. Lock in volume contracts, convert to confinement, and a total mixed ration to control costs per hundredweight. Carl was a careful man and not a reckless one. He had saved for 2 years, shopped equipment prices across 3 dealers, and he signed a $1.4 million note at 6.2% to build a confinement barn for 400 head and finance the milking parlor, upgrade, and the feed delivery system. His monthly debt service came to roughly $9,300. He shook hands with the co-op representative the same week and signed a 3-year supply agreement for ultra-pasteurized commodity milk. He was doing exactly what the projections said to do. Dale Voss would have approved of every line item. Mara, walking her pasture fence that fall, calculated that Carl's debt service alone was more than she had earned in any single year since 2003. She went back to Ruth's ledgers that night and read the 1974 margin note again. Building a direct sales dairy from a standing stop with 34 animals and no existing market relationships is not a fast process. Mara drove her deliveries herself in the first years, a 12-year-old pickup with a refrigerated box she had installed secondhand, making Tuesday and Friday runs into Fond du Lac and down to Sheboygan County. The cheesemaker's name was Lars Henriksen, and he was exacting about component consistency in a way that made him a demanding buyer and a useful one, because he returned every test result to Mara, with notes on what he had observed in the curd behavior of each batch. By 2005, she was learning the milk from the inside out. Through his corrections, the restaurants were simpler. Two chefs who wanted rich cream for their kitchen programs and cared about provenance in the way that chefs in that era were beginning to care about it, wanting to put a farm name on the menu rather than a distributor's invoice. Mara gave them exactly what they asked for and did not raise her price for the first 2 years, building the relationship before the margin, which was Ruth's approach to most things. If you have ever watched a small operation run this way, with no outside money and no debt and no safety net beyond the month-by-month checks that came in late and sometimes had to be chased, you may already understand something about the particular stubbornness it requires. It is not dramatic. It is just showing up twice a day for the cows and once a week for the deliveries and reading the ledger at night under the lamp. If you have something in your own life that requires that kind of steady, unrewarded attention, the kind that does not pay off in the first year or the third, you will recognize what Mara was doing in those years. Drop a comment below if that sounds familiar. By 2008, she had 4 direct buyers, a 5th in conversation, and a price per hour, hundredweight, that had climbed to $31. She was running 52 head and had begun to cull more aggressively using Ruth's component standards, keeping only the animals whose monthly tests held above 4.9 butterfat and 3.7 protein. The culled animals sold as breeding stock to 2 other small dairies who had begun to hear what was happening on the Feld farm. Carl was running 390 head by then, and his co-op check looked large in absolute numbers, though the margin on each hundredweight, after feed and labor and debt service, was thinner than he liked to discuss. In January of 2008, at the Fond du Lac Dairy Producers' Annual Meeting, Dale Voss addressed the room and made a case for what he called the competitive dairy future of the region. He referenced operations by scale and by efficiency, and he spent 10 minutes on the component testing data that showed conventional Holstein operations making incremental gains in fat and protein ratios through ration science. Mara was in the room near the end of the meeting. A producer from across the county asked whether the small operations like the Feld Dairy had a place in the competitive future Dale was describing. Dale had his glasses off by then, turning them in his hands in the way that meant he was about to say something he considered obvious. "What you're running over there is a boutique hobby, not a commercial dairy," he said to Mara directly, in a register that was not unkind. "We'd like you to understand the trajectory of where dairying is actually going." He said it the way a doctor explains a prognosis to a patient who has been insisting on an alternative treatment, with patience and the confidence of a man whose projections had never been wrong about anything that mattered. Mara picked up her coat and her folder and drove home. She did not complain about this to anyone. She was not, by temperament, a person who catalogued injuries. She drove the county road home in the dark and put the truck in the shed and went to check on the animals. which were in their paddocks in the cold January night, in the quiet way brown Swiss stand in winter, patient and steam-breathed and present. She went in and wrote in the ledger before she went to bed. The years between 2008 and 2012 were the years when Mara Feld built what she was building. A fifth buyer came on in 2009, an artisan creamery in Door County that had been searching for a reliably high-component whole milk source for a cultured cream product. A sixth in 2010, a subscription model she developed herself. 12 households in Fond du Lac and the surrounding township, who paid a monthly fee for a weekly farm-door delivery of raw cream and whole milk. She priced it at $38 per hour hundredweight equivalent, which was more than 4 times what Carl's Co-op was paying him per unit of milk, and almost exactly what Dale's extension office had said in 2003 was not a business model. She hired one part-time helper for morning milkings in the spring of 2011, a retired grain farmer named Ev, who had grown up on a dairy and whose patience with the animals matched his patience with the fence repairs that needed doing every season. If you have ever spent time in a dairy barn in July, you know what the ground looks like outside a confinement operation in a dry summer. Let me tell you about what Mara's pastures looked like in July of 2012 compared to Carl's. Mara ran what is called a managed intensive rotation. She had expanded Ruth's original 11 paddocks to 19, each one a section of ground that she moved the herd onto briefly and then rested for 45 to 60 days before returning. What this mimics is the movement pattern of a wild herd, concentrating animals briefly on a small area, pressing organic matter into the soil surface, dunging evenly, then moving on and leaving the grass to recover. The roots of perennial grasses under this system grow deeper than under continuous or even light rotational grazing, because the rest periods allow full photosynthetic recovery before the next defoliation. Deeper roots hold more moisture. More moisture means more living matter in the soil. More living matter means the soil structure itself, its pore space and microbial population, retains water rather than shedding it. In July of 2012, Fond du Lac County recorded its third driest month since 1932. Dairies across the county watched their corn silage yields collapse, and their hay prices spiked to levels that made the cost per hundredweight math ugly in ways the projections had not accounted for. Carl Bauer spent $14,000 in purchased feed in July and August alone, figures he shared with no one but his wife, who kept the books. Mara's pastures did not stop producing. They slowed, as every pasture does in drought, but the paddocks she had been rotating for 9 years had accumulated enough organic matter and root depth that the perennial grasses stayed green for 3 weeks longer than the conventionally grazed fields visible from the road. She had no feed loan that summer. Nora Feld arrived in May of 2012. She was 24, fresh from an agricultural business program at Iowa State, and she had a specific competence in dairy enterprise budgeting that made her very good at looking at a balance sheet and a very confident young person in an extension office. She came because her uncle, Mara's brother, had asked her to spend a summer doing the books for the operation before Mara got in over her head, which he had been predicting since 2003. The per-cow cost of keeping brown Swiss on rotation is almost 40% higher than confinement Holstein per hundredweight, Nora said, in the first week sitting at the kitchen table with Ruth's ledgers and Mara's income records both open in front of her. Dale's projections aren't wrong. The scale math just doesn't favor what you're doing. Mara looked at the ledger, not at Nora. What year does your model assume I'm selling commodity milk? Nora did not have a ready answer for that. That summer, Mara arranged through the University of Wisconsin's Dairy Genetics Laboratory, the same extension infrastructure that housed Dale Voss's office, to have her herd genotyped for the A2A2 beta-casein marker. The results came back in September. 94% of her milking herd tested A2, A2, homozygous. The geneticist who ran the panel called her and asked whether she would be willing to participate in a small research study on naturally occurring A2 herd distributions. She said yes. He asked who had built the herd. She said her grandmother. He was quiet for a moment and then said that was unusual. Nora sat with those results for a week. She had heard of A2 milk marketing in the context of the premium consumer market, which her training had filed under specialty niche, a rounding error in aggregate dairy economics. 94% natural occurrence in a single herd was not a rounding error. She started asking Mara questions about the ledgers in October. The questions at first were the questions of a person checking for errors. She wanted to know whether the co-op's monthly component tests had been independently verified, and Mara handed her 4 years of records with the testing lab's contact information at the top of each sheet. She wanted to know whether the premium pricing in the direct contracts was sustainable at volume, and Mara showed her the waiting list correspondence for the farm door subscription, 11 households who had been on the list for 4 months. She wanted to understand the rotation system, and Mara walked her through it in the November pastures, paddock by paddock, explaining the rest intervals and the root biology with the same flat patience she brought to everything she explained. By January of 2013, Nora had stopped looking for the error. It took another year, roughly, for her to see what she had not been equipped to look for. The thing her agribusiness program had not taught her, not because it was a bad program, but because it was designed to prepare students for the dairy industry as it existed, was how to measure the value of 50 years of selective attention to a particular herd. Her models assumed that genetic value was captured in industry testing programs and bred into the population through AI services. They assumed that soil value was captured in nutrient tests and expressed through purchased inputs. They assumed, in short, that everything relevant had already been quantified and could be reproduced. Ruth's ledgers were evidence that something relevant had been quantified by an entirely different method and could not be reproduced at all, only inherited. Nora did not announce any of this as a conclusion. She simply began in the spring of 2013 to rebuild the component recording system on a spreadsheet, pulling every entry from both of Ruth's ledgers into a database she could query by animal, by sire, by year, by season. She worked on it in the evenings at the kitchen table. Mara did not ask her what she was building. She just made sure the lamp was working and the coffee was on. By 2014, Nora had the dam line data mapped across 6 generations and could show, in a chart she printed on the office printer and pinned to the wall, the continuous tracking of butter fat and protein percentage from Ruth's original 12 heifers through to the current milking herd. The trend was not dramatic. It was the slow accumulation of 50 years of modest decisions, each one invisible, the aggregate of which was a herd with component performance that no buying program or AI service had assembled deliberately. Bess had calved in early August of that drought summer. A bull calf from a sire Mara had selected specifically for his dam line component records. He was the 6th generation of direct descent from the original Bess in Ruth's 1967 records, and Mara had named the dam line consistently across every entry. She put his sire information in the ledger the afternoon he was born, Fond du Lac County dry and pale under the August heat, and noted his birth weight and the dam's milk components in the same ink. The calf's genetics, as the panel would later confirm, were A2A2, clean through 5 dam line generations. Things moved slowly and then more quickly. In the spring of 2016, a man named Sven Hallberg drove a rented truck up Mara's gravel lane and knocked on the parlor door. He was a senior buyer for a regional specialty dairy cooperative called Nordic Foods, based out of Minneapolis, which supplied high-component raw cream and artisan fluid milk to a set of buyers in the upper Midwest who were specifically requesting. A creamery contact in Sheboygan had given him Mara's name. He carried a portable milk analyzer in a case under his arm. He ran 3 samples from Mara's bulk tank that morning. He held the 3rd printout for a long time without speaking. He set it down and picked it back up. He looked at the herd in the near paddock through the parlor window for a moment, the big, dark-coated cows moving unhurried in the spring light. "I'm not going to negotiate on this," he said finally, setting the paper on the parlor work table. "This is A2 brown Swiss raw cream composition. We haven't sourced domestically in 11 years. He asked how the herd had been built. Mara told him about Ruth and the Ledgers briefly and without the kind of elaboration that would turn it into a story. He listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the printout. "Your grandmother was keeping records on component selection before the industry had a name for what she was selecting for," he said. It was not a question. He offered $52 per hundredweight for the raw cream allocation and $44 for the fluid milk. The commodity price that week was $14. Nora, who had been standing in the doorway of the parlor for the last 20 minutes without interrupting, did the arithmetic in her head without moving her lips, and then moved her lips slightly. Mara signed the contract 3 days later, after Nora had reviewed every line of it at the kitchen table. Nora looked up when she finished and said simply, "Okay." It was the most words she used that day on the subject. The contract required Mara to expand her herd to maintain volume commitments through seasonal fluctuation. She bought 6 additional A2 certified brown Swiss from the UW research study participants over the following 18 months, raising the herd to 72 head. Nora stayed. She had stopped thinking about leaving sometime in 2015 without ceremony, and by 2016 she was managing the rotation schedule and the component records with a precision that would have surprised her former professors. In November of 2018, the Fond du Lac County Farm Bureau newsletter ran an opinion column. Dale Voss had written a piece on dairy consolidation and the county's long-term production outlook, and near the bottom he had included a sentence about small specialty operations. He wrote that some county operators had pursued premium niche markets with some success, though these remained anomalies in the broader picture, and that the numbers did not scale to any meaningful county-level economic contribution. An anomaly. He had by then used 3 different words for the same idea. By November of 2018, the commodity milk price was in the 3rd month of a decline that would take it to $11.90 per hour, hundredweight, by September of 2019. It was not a sudden crash. It was the slow arithmetic of oversupply meeting thinning margins, and it showed up first in the operations that had expended on debt during the growth years and were now servicing that debt from a narrowing spread between input costs and milk price. Dozens of Fond du Lac County dairies closed between 2018 and 2020. Some were sold, some were foreclosed. The county lost 41 producing dairy farms in those 24 months. Carl Bauer's monthly debt service was $9,300. His co-op check in October of 2018 covered his feed costs and his labor and left $212 before debt. He told his wife that December that he had called the bank and asked about restructuring, and the bank had told him what the bank tells you when the underlying price trend is not in your favor. Carl was not a careless man or an unlucky one. He had done what the projections said to do, in the order they said to do it, at the time they said to do it. He had borrowed when credit was available, and interest was manageable, and the co-op was offering multi-year supply contracts that looked like stability. The projections had not been lying about any particular number. They had been right about what the industry was doing and wrong about how long it could sustain the direction it was moving. Carl could not have known this in 2006, and neither could Dale Voss. The model they both trusted had not yet been tested by the thing that would test it. Mara drove past Carl's operation twice a week on her delivery route, and she could see the changes from the road. The confinement barn that had held 400 head in 2012 was running closer to 250 by late 2018 because Carl had begun reducing stocking density as his margins thinned, selling animals before the debt pressure forced him to. The lane into his property, which had been graveled fresh in 2007, had gone to mud and ruts. The equipment shed light that used to burn till 10 at night was dark by 7. Mara did not hear about his situation from Carl. She heard it from his wife, Jana, who called in February of 2019 and asked in a steady and quiet voice whether Mara knew anyone who might be interested in purchasing a parcel of ground. Carl's lenders split the farm in March of 2019, selling the livestock and equipment at auction separately from the land. The 214-acre eastern parcel went to Mara Feld for $340,000, financed at a rate that was 11 points lower than Carl's original note because she carried no other debt. She wrote the earnest money check herself. She bought the Wenzel farm in the summer of 2020, 130 acres to the north that had gone into receivership the previous fall, for $270,000. She began running cattle on the Wenzel paddocks that October. It was Nora who put the two purchases together in a spreadsheet that winter and stared at the total for a while. She understood the arithmetic perfectly. What she was still absorbing was the fact that the ground had come available because of the same commodity price collapse that Mara's direct market structure had entirely insulated her from. The structural shock had not been random. It had fallen precisely on the path Dale Voss's projections had mapped as the only viable direction. The county assessor's document arrived in April of 2021. Nora was at the kitchen table when the mail came. She opened it without particular ceremony, the way she opened every piece of farm correspondence, and read the assessed net worth across all three properties, $2.1 million. She read it a second time quietly to be sure of the figure. The number covered three properties, 431 acres, 118 brown Swiss cows on rotation across 26 paddocks, the Nordic Foods contract, the breeding records, the subscription customer list, the equipment, and the paid-off parcels. It did not cover Ruth's ledgers, which were beyond assessment. Nora understood this distinction, and Mara would have agreed with it. Nora read the number aloud. Mara was at the sink rinsing the morning's milk equipment, her back to the room, and she turned off the water when she heard the figure but did not turn around. She stood there for a moment with the quiet that comes when an arithmetic you have been doing for 18 years finally balances, and then she set the rinse cloth on the counter and poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the burner. That was the whole of her response. Dale Voss called 2 weeks later. He was retired by then, had been since 2019, but he had heard through the county farm network what had happened with the Bauer property and the Wenzel property, and he had done enough of the arithmetic to understand the shape of it. His voice on the phone was the voice of a careful man who had updated a prior belief. "I want to ask you something," he said. "The A2 genetic program. Your grandmother started that before we had a name for it." She didn't know what she was selecting for, Mara said. She just kept what worked. He was quiet. "I'd like to see the ledgers sometime," he said. "If that's all right." She told him he was welcome to come look. In the weeks that followed, the telephone at the farm was busy with a kind of call Mara had not received before. Neighbors who had survived the consolidation wave with small operations intact, or who had taken early reductions and held onto some ground, asking about the rotation system, asking about A2 genetics and where to source tested animals, asking whether Mara and Nora, 4 of them came on a Saturday in June of 2021 and spent 3 hours on the property. Mara showed them the grazing plan. Nora walked them through the component records. She had started keeping them in a binder format alongside the original ledgers. Same categories Ruth had used, same columns, same monthly cadence. Ruth's 2 leather ledgers live now in an archival sleeve. Nora had ordered from a preservation supply company acid-free paper between each page. The sleeve itself inside a labeled cardboard box on the top shelf of the parlor cabinet where Mara had found them in January of 2003. No one had moved them from that shelf in 18 years. Mara paid off the note on Carl's land in 30 months. The Wenzel note would clear in 2024 at the current rate. She refused 2 approaches from a specialty dairy investment group that expressed interest in acquiring a stake in the Nordic food supply arrangement. She had no interest in scaling what she was doing, which was precisely the model the investment group found attractive and Mara found beside the point. Nora was 29 years old in 2017 when she stopped returning calls from the recruiting firm in Des Moines that had been offering her an agribusiness analyst position every 6 months for 2 years. She did not make a speech about this. She just stopped calling them back, and then the call stopped, and she kept the rotation calendar on the wall of the parlor office and the breeding records in the same leather-cornered binder. There is a thing that happens in the dairy business and in most other businesses when a single dominant model goes wrong at scale. The failure does not distribute evenly. It falls hardest on the people who most faithfully follow the projections, because they are the ones who borrowed the most to match the projected requirements, the ones whose debt service assumed prices the market eventually refused to sustain. The people who survived the 2018 wave in Fond du Lac County were the ones with low debt or no debt or a price structure that the wave did not reach. Mara had all 3. She had not engineered this. She had simply declined to enter the system the projections described, because Ruth's ledgers described a different system that had worked for 50 years on 87 acres without a commodity contract. There are 2 ways of knowing something about a piece of ground. One of them requires a spreadsheet and a projection and a comparison to the aggregate performance of every similar piece of ground in the database. It is wide and fast and confident, and it tells you what the average answer is. The other requires 50 years of handwritten records and the willingness to keep only the cows whose milk tells you something true, and to walk the paddocks in August when the drought is hard and notice which grass is still standing. It is narrow and slow and specific, and it tells you what this piece of ground can do in this soil, with these animals, in a dry year and a wet one. Dale Voss was not wrong about the average answer. He was wrong about which question Mara was answering. What holds in the drought is not what the model projected. What holds is what has roots. On an evening in October of 2021, Mara walked the south fence of what had been Carl's eastern parcel, the paddocks she had rested since September and would open again in spring. The brown Swiss moved through the late light ahead of her, their dark coats catching the amber the way they do, unhurried. The one at the fence line, a 4-year-old, with the same heavy shoulder and calm eye as every Bess before her, turned and looked back. Sixth generation from Ruth's 1967 heifer. 7 generations if you counted the one in the ledger. She stood in the October light and regarded Mara with the ancient patience of the breed. Nora was behind Mara by 20 steps, her notebook in her hand, writing something down. Inside the farmhouse, on the top shelf of the parlor cabinet, 2 cracked leather ledgers held 50 years of what Ruth had known about this ground and these animals, in handwriting that had never assumed anyone else would need to read it. What endures is not what scales, it is what belongs.